Good morning. We have a little science lesson today to continue hearing about the nitrogen cycle. So on Monday, you learned a little about the nitrogen cycle, but it is a very brief explanation in the book that we were reading from. So I want to show a few extra pictures. You had an extra video on that as well that hopefully some of you found helpful. But it gets into some of the chemistry that really you're not going to learn much about until you're in junior high and high school. And some of the things we're going to look at today also involve some of that chemistry, but as far as what we're going to write in our notes, it's going to be just the basics of, kind of like with photosynthesis, just the steps that are the main ones to remember for your age in this process. But I know for some of you, you're interested in a little bit extra, and there's a lot more to it than just the simple 4 steps that we're going to be writing in our notes today. So I've got a picture to show you of the nitrogen cycle, and we'll walk through some of these, the steps in this process. Now, nitrogen is an element in nature. So it is about 80% of our air, and it's in the periodic table of elements as an element that we have around us. So about 80% of our air is nitrogen. We need nitrogen to be able to live and grow. So the process of it going through the soil and then into plants and then the animals that eat those plants and then eventually back into the air is the nitrogen cycle. As that element continues flowing through nature, it actually changes forms, and you don't need to know all the details of that, but it changes forms as it continues to flow through different parts of the cycle. Different organisms, but also the air in the soil. It changes as it goes through those. So I'll show you a little diagram that I'm actually going to post in Bright Thinker so that if you have a printer at home, you could copy or you could print a copy of this off. And if you want to try to draw it yourself, you're certainly welcome to, but you don't have to. This is a harder one to just draw freehand. So it's not going to be a requirement, but you're certainly welcome to. Many of you I know are great artists, so this might be a fun challenge. Oops, sorry, wrong one. This is it. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle. There's also a blank form of this without these boxes filled in that if we were in school, we would be filling out. I'll post both of them in Bright Thinker so that if you want to just print it off with the information filled in, you can do that. Or you could fill out one with some blanks to fill in yourself. But I know some of you don't have printers, so you can't do that. So nitrogen is moving through our planet in this cycle. So there's not exactly one starting point, but we're going to mainly think of it starting in the air. So 80% of our air is this element nitrogen. Now nitrogen moves from our atmosphere out in the air to the earth in a couple of different ways. It could be through rain or it can be through thunder actually that actually changes its form. So nitrogen is in the atmosphere. Fixation is the process of turning unusable nitrogen into nitrogen that's usable for plants and eventually animals. So it changes the element itself. So it changes its form so that it becomes usable for organisms. Now, once it enters into, from the atmosphere into our soil, then it actually is used by the plants first. Okay, so from the soil, the nitrogen enters the plants through its roots. Now, animals will eat those plants, as we've seen with food chains and food pyramids. So it's not just energy that's passed on from animal to animal or organism to organism. The nitrogen goes through the soil to the plant, and then once the animal eats it, that animal is getting nitrogen. Animals return nitrogen to the soil in a couple of different ways. They will return nitrogen to the soil actually through their waste. So this is a picture of the little bird pooping. That's a way that nitrogen goes to the soil. And when there are animals that are decomposing or plants that are decomposing, nitrogen returns to the soil that way too. So nitrogen returns to the soil after the animal eats it. Nitrogen gives energy to new plants. There's that picture of new seeds growing. Now, once there's animal waste or dead organisms that are in the soil, it returns back to the atmosphere through a process called denitrification. This should have an I there. It's denitrification, turning fixed nitrogen back to its natural form up in the air. So we start in the air. That's what we're going to call the first step of this nitrogen cycle. So starting in the air, where does it go next? To the soil. So it goes to the soil through rain and lightning. There is that process of fixation, which turns it into a nitrogen that's going to be able to be used by the plants. It goes to the soil. The soil, once the nitrogen is in the soil, it helps these plants to grow. It goes into the roots, and the animals eat the plant, get some of that nitrogen. Then from the animal, what happens next? How does it return to the soil? Through waste and decomposing organisms, so dead plants and animals. Then it returns from the soil back to the air. Okay? So air, soil, plant, animal, back to the soil, and then back to the air. So it takes a little time before it gets back to the air because it's soil, plant, animal, then back to the soil, and then up to the air again. Here is another way of looking at it. This is a kind of cool website that has some fun history in it too, Dexter's. So this shows the process as well of the nitrogen cycle. And this gets into a little bit more of the chemistry behind it. It says this picture shows the flow of the nitrogen cycle. The most important part of the cycle is bacteria. Bacteria helps nitrogen change between states so that it can be used. When nitrogen is absorbed by the soil, different bacteria help it to change states so it can be absorbed by plants. Animals then get their nitrogen from the plants. So in this one, there's atmospheric nitrogen. That's how you would write the atmospheric nitrogen as the element. And then there's nitrogen fixing soil bacteria. It becomes ammonium. Here it shows, right? Nitrogen fixing bacteria living in legume root nodules, says there. You don't need to know all these details, but and then it changes form. As you can see, here are the different ways to describe nitrogen depending on its state, depending on if it's nitrate, nitrite, ammonium. So that is going to get into more of the chemistry behind it. It says fixation is the first step in the process of making nitrogen usable by plants. Bacteria changes nitrogen into ammonium. Now, nitrification is the process by which ammonium gets changed into nitrates by bacteria. Nitrates are what the plants can then absorb. Assimilation is how plants get nitrogen. They absorb nitrates from the soil into their roots. Then the nitrogen gets used in amino acids, nucleic acids, and chlorophyll. Modification is part of the decaying process that decomposers help with. When a plant or animal dies, decomposers like fungi and bacteria turn the nitrogen back into ammonium so it can re-enter the nitrogen cycle. And finally, denitrification. Extra nitrogen in the soil gets put back out into the air. There are special bacteria that perform this task as well. So denitrification brings it back out. Okay, it says about 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. However, this is mostly not usable by animals and plants. It's used in fertilizer to help plants grow faster. Nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. Too much of it can also cause acid rain. It has no color, odor, or taste. It's actually used in explosives sometimes. And about 3% of our body weight is nitrogen. Okay, so this is, once again, getting into some of the chemistry that you don't necessarily have to know for third grade, but it is interesting to learn about. So we are going to, once again, I'll have posted the image if you'd like to print that out and include that in your notes. But otherwise, I'm going to have you just write in your notes some of the basic steps of the nitrogen cycle. Okay, so we're going to say, and this is going to be in your science notebook. I'm just going to do this dictated, and then I'll type it up for you to check. But in your science notebook, we should have our header. Today's date is November 18th for you. Science and nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen cycle with the silent final E at the end of cycle. And we're just going to write 4 steps. So you can just have 1, 2, 3, 4 down your page, and you can spread it out. So for step 1, we'll say nitrogen moves from the air to the soil. Nitrogen moves from air to the soil is the first part of the cycle. Nitrogen moves from air to soil. In the second step, and pause if you're not ready for that. Nitrogen moves from soil into living things or organisms. Nitrogen moves from soil to living things. So this step combines the animals taking it up from the soil and the plant taking it up from the soil and the animal eating and consuming that nitrogen from the plant that it eats. So number 2 on your page is nitrogen moves from the soil into living things. Remember what happens next after it's soaked up into the plant. The animal eats that plant. How does it get back into the soil? Through waste and through decomposing organisms. So for number 3, you'll say nitrogen moves back to the soil, and in parentheses, through animal waste or dead organisms. So in parentheses, through animal waste or dead organisms. And for number 4, the last step is nitrogen moves from the soil back to the air. Nitrogen moves from soil back to air. Okay, let's look at what should be on your page. Okay. There's nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen, gonna make sure the words match yours exactly. So pulling this up. Moves from air to the soil. Nitrogen moves from soil to living things. And you could write in parentheses organisms. Next, nitrogen moves back to soil through animal waste and dead organisms. I don't know why I keep typing it that way. Organisms. And finally, nitrogen moves from soil back to air. That's all we've got for notes. Those are the 4 steps, even though there's a lot more you could say about the nitrogen cycle, including the way that it actually changes its form depending on where it is in the cycle. Pause the video here if you need it longer. Okay. That is all for the nitrogen cycle. You'll have a couple of different things that are optional in Bright Thinker, depending on if you have access to a printer. To have a picture in your notes would be really helpful. And if any of you would like to just try to draw it on your own, you are certainly welcome to do that. But these are the 4 steps that you need to know for the quiz that you'll be taking and for a test that we'll have after Thanksgiving break. Okay. I will see if there's any other cool resources so that if you're interested to find out more of the chemistry behind this process, it may be a little bit too difficult, but I'll be posting those in case you're interested, but those are just optional. And we'll talk to you all later. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.